The desire to paint, or the need to paint, I think is, you know, a curious one for me, because it was never a conscious decision. You know, I kind of think it's interesting. I've always thought if you choose something like being a painter, you probably wouldn't end up doing it. For me, it wasn't a choice. It was something that I just found myself doing, you know, and I think, you know, I grew into becoming a painter because I just found myself doing it all the time. It was, you know, a language that suited my nature. I think I could express myself, you know, to a certain potential that I guess, you know, I didn't have academically, or you know, I didn't really have any skills as such that I could tap into or that I was aware of. So landing into painting the way I did, I just think I was very fortunate that, you know, that path kind of presented itself. And, you know, 30 years later, I'm still painting. It's interesting that, you know, I think the way I landed into painting and the way that just sort of happened is probably not unlike the way I kind of approach painting, that, you know, I just kind of believe that your life is driven by some kind of intuition. That's how I've always approached my painting. It's an intuitive sort of line of thought or line of belief. I use the word subconscious a lot because I think that the subconscious is, you know, largely who we are. I think a lot of the other stuff is conditioning and social expectations and all that stuff, but there's something for me very real about getting into the studio and painting, because all that stuff falls away and you're just connected with a very kind of, I guess, our sort of primal selves, our child self, the self that's untouched and untainted. I've always been interested in spontaneity, rawness, you know, an approach that's not calculated. So I guess it's those elements of rawness and nature, the nature within ourselves, when you kind of connect or tap into that part of yourself, that I suppose, you know, it's landscape in a very broad term. My internal landscape. The approach was a lot, I guess, like drawing first, putting down the line, and working up close often is good for me, because it allows me to sort of be a little bit less conscious of a composition. So I can just listen to some internal sort of structure that we kind of have that's innately there. But there are definitely conversations that you have with the paint. And my process is putting down paint, wiping it off, and repainting and wiping it off and repainting until you reach a moment where something starts to kind of just take over. You're not sort of getting angst and bothered about where you're putting the mark anymore, because it's starting to dictate itself through the conversation. It's building up, and that rhythm or that connectedness is the point that you need to kind of get to before the work starts to talk itself or have its own conversation. You can start to separate yourself from it, and your painting, you know, hopefully is there. You've had your talk, you've finished your talk, the painting's done. So the process for me is ultimately what painting is about. A body of work, when you made an exhibition and you put it up and you walk in and you just go, wow, you know, that's a hell of a lot of energy gone into that, or a hell of a lot of heart, or a hell of a lot of, you know, just angst, or a hell of a lot of emotion, or a hell of a lot of life that goes into it, because you're sucked, you know, you're really sucked dry when you're painting a, you know, a picture that works, that's big, that's demanding to pull it off, that takes it out of you. You know, again, it's I think what I identify with and what I respond to so much in working with Indigenous painters is the lack of inhibition, the lack of trying. When you kind of drop all that, you're in a very natural state with paint. Paint's such a luscious, you know, sensuous medium. It dictates itself, and you really are just there to kind of, you know, let yourself be at one with it. And they, you know, Indigenous painters are just so good at that. So Autonomy 2 was a painting that was done at that same time. But, you know, so it was a point where I'd reached, you know, I'd come up against something in myself, and, you know, and that coincided with a difficult time in my life. And, you know, I just felt quite broken in myself. I felt quite empty. So to come back and approach painting like that just didn't ring right to me. And that's when I started to reject everything that I was putting down, all the marks that I was putting down on the canvas, because they didn't really mean anything. I wanted to find something that was more distinct or a bit clearer for me. Something, you know, trying to formulate something, trying to formulate a language that was clearer. Little examples, I guess, that triggered that for me also was, you know, I was looking at Philip Guston's late drawings and how beautiful and minimal they were, and said so much, they're so simple. And, you know, so I just kept rejecting everything I was putting down, and in the end the works became that rejection and that repeated erasion, and this body sort of built up, a skin built up, but it just felt that, you know, within that sort of rejection and building up, there was this kind of, you know, there was an atmosphere, you know, within that void. And for me it was just, you know, it was true to where I was at. There was no line of thought as such going into the work. It was purely action and emotion, physical action and emotion. As that sort of continued on for a period of time, again, something sort of happened in my life, in my personal life, and it's interesting for me that it's always somehow connected with what's happening in my life. So I, you know, obviously had something positive or something lift. You know, my spirits were lifted, I guess, and I remember painting Cockatoo and For Love at the same time. I think they were 1993. So all the grey had sort of literally left the paintings, and I was using, you know, beautiful lemon yellows and whites, and finding that I was putting down form. Form started to come in, but very minimally. They were sort of haphazardly placed, very sparse. Beautiful sort of, you know, light. I was kind of really wanting light to come through in the work. And I think those two works are kind of indicative of where that breakthrough, that shift, that change. And then, you know, as you keep working, you know, things kind of speak for themselves. You know, you're exercising, you know, you're painting, yourself, your thoughts are developing, because you know, there's an invisible thread or a line that's kind of, you know, dictating. It's your intuition, it's your desire for something to connect up, and the line is very metaphorical for me, because, you know, after the shapes starting to happen, those shapes very clearly started to become more linear, and then painting like Slow Rome happened. That was a breakthrough work, in the sense that, you know, the line was very distinctly there in the work. It's a strong painting, it's a black and white painting. Then it was Mount Warning, a huge painting. I had to have a platform to paint it on. But it was a celebration for me. The line had sort of just joined up. It was a dance. And you know, it was and then straight after that, it was so exciting for me that the line had suddenly just taken on this sort of, you know, this flow, this big sort of, you know, suddenly I felt like I was, like I'd arrived. And I just, you know, then I painted Bon Voyage, which was, you know, similar, like a huge racing car track, and, you know, and then I painted Pink Line. And they were real breakthrough works for me after those big paintings, and I chose to work really large when the line started to kind of just take off like that somehow. The physicality of the demand of that, you know, working up close when you're actually on such a huge scale, the physical demand and just feeling what the line's doing, and then stepping back and having a look. It's just like, you know, that was a great few years of painting those lines when they first started. And then I think for the next 8 years I was on my way. I felt like I just could have painted night and day, 24 hours around the clock, because I just, you know, I felt like I'd sort of, I'd found for a moment a bit of my language.